Hi, and welcome to the 15th episode of the poLit podcast, the podcast for political posits. I hope you're all well and in good health. This week, we are going to have a discussion about the witch and the political discourse surrounding the otherness of the witch. Before we come to that, though, please, if you haven't already done so, go to the blog, like, share, subscribe, and follow. Please join the emailing list on the blog where you can get loads of content which doesn't become a podcast episode. Alongside this, if you haven't listened to last week's episode with Dr. Francesco Belcastro on sport, politics, and international relations, go ahead and take a listen. It's only half an hour long. Okay, so today I am joined with Chloe Carroll, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Limerick in Ireland. Their current research involves the image of the witch throughout film and television, and how the witch's gendered identity has existed in waves and is currently undergoing a new transformation. Their research interests focus on the cultural value of monsters and their representations. Okay, so Chloe, it's very nice to have you on the podcast today. I'd like to begin with a broad question, if you don't mind, which is, how do you define the witch? No easy question.
Thank you for having me on. That is a really big question to start with, and it's something I'm trying to answer in my PhD. I think when you define the witch, the way I approach her is as a monster. Historically, culturally, I approach the body of the witch as a monster because that way I can look at the monstrous body and see how meaning has been inscribed, deciphered, how it's evoked. And I mean, it really depends what way you're looking at the witch. I look at the witch as a gendered entity as well as a monster, and how, as a woman, it's been a persecuted figure throughout history. But I mean, there's other ways of viewing the witch. You've got magical being, you've got modern religions. The way you look at her, you can't fully say it's an oppressed figure. So I think we need to be careful there when we approach the witch, because the popular imagination says, oh, it's a green, ugly woman. Whereas when I look at her, I say, well, it's a woman.
Okay, so there's something there that I'd like to press you on a little bit, which is this notion of the witch being a gendered body. Can you speak to that? Can you explain to the listeners what you mean by that?
Well, when I say gendered entity, I mean, I would look at the historical documentations and religious doctrines such as the Malleus Maleficarum, which was essentially a witch hunting guidebook, and it would describe the witch as most likely to be women. And this goes back to social and gender constructs in saying that a woman is weaker, she's more feeble, and therefore she's more open to be possessed by the devil. Essentially, if we even go back as far as, Adam and Eve, or, Adam and Lilith, as Jewish mythology would tell you, it would say that Eve was created for Adam. She was made weaker, but Lilith was made from the same clay, which is why we look at her as the first witch, the strongest witch, and kind of had her own authority. And again, it always comes back to women, the persecuted, the demonized. They are always the lesser, really.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you speak about Lilith, actually, because I think in Jewish theology, or in sort of social theology, Lilith causes cot death, if I remember rightly. And that's really fascinating as well. I never thought about the connection between the two. Sort of throw that back onto the theological element. Okay, so I know that you speak a little bit in your work about the relationship between the witch and the monstrous, and the monster. How would you conceptualize, or how would you define the monster broadly? I know that's another really broad question, so I apologize for that.
It is very broad, but again, it really depends, because monster theory is very old. That goes back to the ancients, who wanted to know what monsters meant. They considered them omens. But it's only in the past, it's quite contemporary, that monster theory has been given a name. And it really is a universal task, because how I look at the monster is not how someone in the East would look at the monster. It's not how you would look at the monster. Like, I would approach the witch from a feminist perspective, but somebody else would approach it entirely different. So it really is a universal task. But if we look at umbrella term monster, I think it evokes notions of otherness, of evil, of ugliness. I mean, people think Frankenstein's monster and they think of what James Whales created in the 1931 movie. And that's not what Mary Shelley intended. She didn't describe him that ugly, really. He was monstrous, but the real depiction of him is most likely to look at the Penny Dreadful representation, as opposed to, stitched up like Robert De Niro in the 90s movie, or with big bolts out of his neck. It's a shadow of what Mary Shelley intended, and that's culture, and that's movies, that's developed on the signifier of the monstrous. But really, that's not what they're all about. They're not inherently evil, or at least that's what I argue.
And speaking about film as well, something I wanted to ask you was, do you think that representations of the witch, and sort of broadly the monstrous, but more focusing on the witch, do you think representations of the witch in film have sort of stoked the flames of otherness, or do you think there's been a shift? And at what point would you say that is, if there has been one?
I think the witch has existed in waves on screen. Absolutely. Look at the Wicked Witch. That's kind of firmly put in the green skin and the crone. But they are existing in waves. Again, the Wicked Witch, if we look at Wicked, she's getting her own story. We're sympathizing with the monsters. And I think in terms of otherness, it was reinforced to begin with in cinema. And that's something that's very, very hard to undo. And I think the current wave is responding to political symptoms at the same time, which are attacks on women. And therefore, feminists are combing with mythology and, figures of otherness, such as the witch, and saying, well, actually, this is me, this looks like me. So we're trying to normalize it and kind of embrace this otherness. It's a bit messy, but it's very, very powerful stuff.
Yeah, no, but the messy is real, right? The messy is human, and I think it's a really, really important discourse to be had. And certainly, as you know, I'm a sort of political thinker. Certainly, in sort of the wider realm of policy and in discussions of sort of political discourse more broadly, in the way that sort of intersects with cultural and sociological discussions. Okay, so. I actually do have a really random question for you here. This wasn't written down for me to discuss, but it's just sort of come to me. Is why are witches green?
To be honest, I think part of this again comes back to what we associate with monsters. And in James Whales' adaptation of Frankenstein, black and white movie, the creative artist actually painted Frankenstein green, and that was to give it kind of a strange offset in the monochrome. This green tint of the skin. And I think just green kind of latched on to monsters as a signifier, and especially the Wicked Witch, which I actually think the actress thought
Hi,
some skin
I'm
condition
Kieran
from that paint.
O'Meara, and you're listening to poLit,
green has
the
become a monster
podcast
signifier.
for political
I think
posits.
a lot of that again comes back to, well, the iconic monster Frankenstein. Don't quote me on that, but that's kind of my thinking.
Hello and welcome to
and it was just
the 18th
even on
episode
stage
of the
for
poLit
Frankenstein.
podcast,
I think they painted
the
him blue
podcast for
because they
political
needed
posits.
an immediate
I
monster
hope you're all well
signifier.
and in
Mary
good
Shelley's
health.
is
It's
kind
been
of
a
yellow
week, 2
looking, but
weeks
that
since the
doesn't
last
really instantly
episode,
say that's
which
a
was
monster.
with Dr. Gail
green and blue
Loferman
do.
from the University
Really fascinating. It's a
of
really
Warwick,
good answer.
discussing
As I
populism
say,
and populist
I
foreign
didn't
policy.
plan to ask that.
If you haven't already done so, go and take a listen
some
to
kind of
episode
signifier which came
17.
into
It's a really
discourse
good
at some
episode.
time, as you say. So
Alongside
that's really
that,
fascinating.
since
It's
the
really
last
interesting to
episode, the
Okay,
website
so
has
I'd
had
like
a
to move,
refurbishment,
still
so it
keeping
looks
with
all
the
nice
discussion
and
of the
new.
witch, of course.
Go
But I
check
know
it
that
out if you're in the mood for a think.
research you look
And
a
if
lot
you are in
at
the mood for a
Margaret
think
Atwood.
poLit
And one of
at
the things I'd like to ask you to explain is I'd like to give you a
www.thinkpolit.com.
quote by
Nice and
Margaret
easy to
Atwood,
remember.
and
So
to
go
see
check
if you
out the
can speak to
website,
that a
like,
little bit.
share,
Okay,
and
so
subscribe.
the
And also,
quote
please
is,
don't
I
forget to
knew
follow
that
the
established
podcast on
orders could
whatever
vanish
platform you're
overnight.
using, so that the
Change
next
could also
episode just
be as
automatically
fast as
appears
lightning.
in your
It
library.
can't happen here, could not
Okay,
be
so this
depended
week
on.
I'm joined
Anything could
by
happen
Anna
anywhere,
Maria
given the
Angelescu,
circumstances.
who is a
Would you be
PhD
able to
candidate
elaborate
in political
that a little
science
bit and
at
sort
the
of tie that
National
into your
University
discussion
of
of the
Political
witch?
Studies
Yeah,
and Public
absolutely.
Administration in
Margaret Atwood
Bucharest.
for me is
Their
a very
PhD
powerful
thesis
voice.
concerns
Mostly
Romania's
I just look
relations
at
with
like The
Europe
Handmaid's
and
Tale
Central
sort of
Asia,
narratives.
whilst
But that
exploring the
quote is a
theoretical
very
lens
scary
of
observation for
neoclassical
me.
realism in
The Handmaid's
international
Tale takes place in
relations.
America.
Okay, so
It's
Anna Maria,
inclusive
thank you very
of
much for
the
coming on the
suffering of all women
podcast.
around the globe.
Thank you
And
so
it
much for
shows that
inviting me
even
and
then
for
and
such a
now,
nice
feminism was
introduction.
faltering in Iran
No problem
in
at all.
1984.
So the
Women were
first
being
question
pushed
I'd
out
like
of
to
public
ask you,
sphere
if
of
you don't
education
mind,
and work,
is
and they
just
were
in case any
delegated
of the
back to the
listeners
private
aren't
sphere of virtue
familiar
in the home.
with
And
different
that
kinds
Atwood
of international
acknowledges that
relations
just
theory,
because these
would
issues
you be
weren't
able to
happening in
explain
America
what
doesn't mean they
neoclassical
couldn't
realism
be.
is?
So, you know,
Sure,
rights could
thank you
be
for the
revoked.
question.
Look at
It is
Kristallnacht
actually
was a
very
violent
interesting
attack
because
against Jewish
this is
people
how we
carried out
start
over one
the
night in
seminar on
1938. They were no
international
longer
relations
considered
theories.
human
I'm at
beings
my
simply for the crime of
university.
being Jewish.
So
And obviously history took a
I
tragic
like to
course
start
resulting in
with
the
a
Holocaust,
metaphor,
but it
let's
illustrated
say.
how lingering
Do you
social
believe in
attitudes
free
could
will
grow to have
or
such a
do you believe
colossal
in
effect.
destiny?
And
And I
think that
really
quote
think this
Margaret Atwood
captures
says is
how
you
we
cannot
should
be
see
complacent.
the
History
theories
has
of
shown this can
international
happen.
relations.
It can happen
Because
again.
we have
You know,
theories
we've
that
got
are
the
more
Khmer Rouge
like
regime in Cambodia,
placing states
Romania's
on a
decree
certain path
770. We've got
because of the
Magdalene laundries
anarchic
in Ireland
system.
only closed in 96.
So
There's
the
so much
international
history and
system
quite
is anarchic
modern ones
because
that
there's
makes it
no
really, really scary.
superior
Yeah, no, very
authority
scary.
above the
Completely,
states to
completely.
impose them
And
what to do,
something that I
like
wanted
the
to
government
just
is inside
speak
the
about
state.
was
So here's
on
this
sort of
anarchic
Atwood and the
system
Handmaid's
that
Tale.
places
Do you think that
states on a
the Hulu
certain path
adaptation
that's
is
like a
particularly good?
destiny for
That's a really
ourselves?
great question. I think
Or
it's
there are
good as in
theories
it
that
caused
really
a
believe
political
that there's
movement.
some
It
sort of
created an
free
aesthetic
will
that
at the
people
level of the
really clung
states.
to. The
So,
handmaid,
which means
you know,
that
we've seen
there
it now.
are
I've seen it in
the
Ireland,
decision
you know,
makers at the
for the
internal
they're
level
feeling the abortion
are
movement,
really
and you know,
making their own
handmaids
choices.
are now
And
presentation
they
of something
are the
without even having
ones
to be a voice.
responsible for how the states
So
act
in
in
that
the
sense, I do
international
think it
system.
was revived at a
And
necessary
for the
time
more
through a necessary
structural
medium, and
theories, the
especially
ones
in the
that
Trump
believe in
era,
destiny,
it
let's
really
say,
signified how people
we
were
have
feeling, and it
usually
gave
the
them a certain
realist
way of an
theories,
outlet,
and
but
most of
also
all, it's the
it made people
neo-realist
angry.
theories.
Some of that was
And if
good
you're
anger, but
familiar
some
with
of
the
it was very
international
good anger,
relations
and
theories,
it pushed people
you
out of their
know
complacency.
for
So
sure
in
about
that sense,
Kenneth
a roundabout
Wells.
way, I'm going to
He's
say
the
yes, it is good.
father of
Yeah, no,
neorealism.
it's
But there are also
I think
theories
there's
that
certainly
are
important
less
to talk about. I mean, it's one.
structural and
I think
that are
very few
more
sort of television
related
programs
to
that I've seen, as I say,
the
I just sort of
institutions at
thought
the
of this
level
on the
of the
spot
state,
because
as I said,
I
foreign policymakers,
personally thought it was it
how
was
the state
pretty
is
good. I remember reading the
structured.
book,
And
you know,
we
a
have
few years
here
before the
classical
first
realism
series kind of came out, because
is
a friend of mine
connected
handed
to
me
how
the
decision
book and
makers
was like,
can
"Oh,
make
you know, you
decisions,
should
what's
definitely read
happening
this. I think you'll like it."
inside the state, what's
And
the
I remember
moral
thinking at the
status,
time
what's the
when
foreign
it first
policy
came out that this was really sort of
architecture inside the state.
strange, because I mean that Donald Trump had
Of
just
course,
announced his
besides the realist
candidacy
theories, we
at
have
that point.
liberal theories,
Not to speak sort of too
constructivist
much,
theories,
not to try and
and
make too
all
many
of them
parallels
try to
between the
capture
two.
why the state
But
is
in what way do
acting
you think
in
that
such a
sort of
way in
parts
the
of
international
Gilead, well, I
system
mean, you've
that
sort of
we
spoken about
get
this,
to
but in what
war
way do you
or we
still
don't
see
get to war
parts of
in a
Gilead
certain
in
threat
the
position.
contemporary world, in the real
And
world?
neoclassical
I
realism
draw so
is
many
a very
parallels.
beautiful
My
theory
MA
because
thesis
I
was
believe
literally called The Handmaid's Tale from Ronald
it's
McDonald.
better suited
Yeah,
to explain
I'm all
how
about those
states
parallels.
work because
But
it's
even
as
looking
it
at
is with us,
Reagan
the
society
persons. We
now
don't really
and
believe in
Gilead in the
destiny,
yearbook,
but we also
I
don't
mean,
believe we have absolute
let's take
free
the
will.
figure of Serena
And
Joy.
that's what
We had
neoclassical
Phyllis Schlafly
realism
then with
says
her Ego
also.
Forum.
So
Now
we
we
are
have
on a
Kellyanne
certain
Conway
path,
and
the
Ivanka
states
Trump,
are on a
most
certain
notably,
path
and
given by the
Schlafly was in the mix
anarchic
there as well.
system.
We've
But
got
as
so
well,
many
there are
parallels
decision
that
makers
again,
there who have to
it comes back to
interpret what's
that it was
happening
a
at the
very scary
international
thing.
level.
People were
What's the
criticizing
level
it,
of
saying,
threat?
this isn't
What's
very
the level
feminist.
of
Well,
communication,
actually
of
it was. It was
information
very
that I
feminist
have?
as an
And
opposition
with
to everything
those,
that was
I
going on
have,
then
as a
and
decision
now.
maker, to
I think
make a
there's
decision about my
there's too
state.
many
Should I go to
parallels
war?
going in it,
Should
and I
I
don't
become an
necessarily
ally
think
of that
the
state?
show
Should I
was
join an
pushing for them. I
international
mean,
organization?
Margaret
And
Atwood
so on and
wrote
so
the
forth.
novel in
So
response
neoclassical
to Reagan,
realism
Christian right, all these
places
global
a
issues, and she
transmission
came on
belt
board for the show
between the
as I think, as
international
executive
level
producer,
and the
and he's been
national
leading it.
level, which
He's
is something that was argued to be an error of methodology,
the events
which was argued to be a problem for a theory, but I believe this is the strength of the theory. So neoclassical realism helps us
One of the things
to
I always think is
see
really
structural
interesting about the way
factors
Atwood
that
discusses
are
otherness
interpreted
is
through the personal and institutional mechanism
kind of
at the national level,
the body
and to
can become,
see how
I don't want to
states
say prison,
really
but the way in
adapt
which
to
the
this
body can become sort of the
this
sum total
pressures.
of the way the
So, for
outside
example,
world
let's
perceives
say
the individual.
it's not
And I
enough
think we can
to
absolutely see that in,
think
for example,
as
the way that
neorealists would
Offred
say
is
that states
utilized
would
for her
balance
reproductive
because
capabilities.
that's what
And I think that's what I've always,
anarchy
that's sort of one of the things which always
would
struck me
pressure
about
them
that
to do,
was
is the rational
the connection
behavior for
between the
states.
political, the
It's
body
not enough
and the
to know
feminine,
that. We
or the
have
female
to
figure,
see
and the sort of
what's
social
inside.
connection with
If the
reproduction,
states are
which is sort of,
democracies,
coming
they
through
would
the surface.
balance
But
with
it's interesting.
democracies.
Okay,
They
so
would
one of the
ally
things I'd like you
themselves with
to speak to
democracies,
is
even if
how
they are
do
not
you connect
in
in
a
your own work? How do
really
you connect
balancing
Atwood
behavior.
and the
We
witch
have to
and the
see
monstrous?
what's the
Can you speak to that a little
personal
bit for us?
understanding of the decision
Connection
makers
Atwood,
to
I
see
think,
if the
with
balancing
Atwood, it's more
will
because
occur
she
in that
raises, I think actually she
prescribed
had
way or in another
a witch
manner. So this is
ancestor or
why there are
something.
differences.
I know
And
she was quite involved
neoclassical
in that work.
realism
I don't necessarily
is
draw
quite a new
parallels
theory.
between
It
Atwood
started to be
and
developed per
handmaids and stuff
se,
like that to the witch. But I
like
do
in the
say,
past 30
in the
years,
terms of monstrous,
but
I
the
say
name
that
was
these are monstrous
put in
human beings doing
1998
monstrous
by
acts.
Gideon Rose
And again,
in an
these are women
article.
who
He
are
said that
donning
these
that
kind of
political
theories
aesthetic of
are
the handmaid that does
neoclassical,
do with the
and
witch.
it's neoclassical
So
because
the way feminism is moving and clinging to these popular culture adaptations, I think you could really draw parallels there.
Yeah, no, completely. In that sense of sort of the otherness of the female. Yeah, I think that's right. I think sort of the otherness of the monstrous. I think that's really fascinating.
Yeah, and exactly. Puritans as well. The Puritan values she integrates in there. You can't exactly overlook that in terms of how persecuting handmaids was the same as the witches.
Yeah, no, spot on. I think spot on with that. That's really, really good. So I would like to pick up a quote of yours actually to explore a little bit.
Oh.
I know you recently published a piece in the Frame Cinema Journal about concerning sort of witches, which is entitled "Wouldst Thou Like to Live Deliciously? Female Persecution and Redemption in the Witch." So I'd like you to just explain this quote. I think you've done. I think you've sort of explained this already a little bit, but I'd love to hear it in sort of more overt terms or more explicit terms. Which is, and the quote I'd like to ask you to unpack is: "The witch illustrates that the threat of traditional values is not relegated to the past." Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. Great quote. I think when I consider The Witch and especially Eggers' fantastic movie, he placed that historical witch. He brought her into contemporary society and said, we could draw parallels from that Puritan society to here, which we absolutely shouldn't be able to do. We could look at Thomason and see her experiences, her female experience as a daughter, as a sister, as a just coming of age in this society. And you really start to feel for her. You can really kind of get in her shoes of the treatment she was experiencing so many witch archetypes. But I think in terms of the traditional values of the witch, it shows that the way she was treated and the values associated with her, well, they still remain here. The way Puritan values persevered, we have puritanically inclined presidents now. And, just to speak to the Trump thing, and it comes back to Atwood on complacency. Just because he is not in office doesn't mean that those values aren't still prevailing. A lot of people came out and owned their values and thoughts on that. They're not gone. We're in like the eye of the hurricane right now where it feels safe, but it is not. This is the moment to really ramp it up and look and say, we will not accept these values anymore. They need to stay in history. And when I brought them in terms of the witch, I guess even then when I wrote it, I didn't see how they were actually very, very true. I had my own experiences since, and I just thought, oh my God, we can't be doing this. This history is literally repeating itself over and over. If we're still like the Puritan values, what hope is there?
It's certainly thought-provoking. I really like that answer to that, actually. This question of what hope is there, and I also think that's something which is often sometimes politicized, but is this notion in all sort of progressive politics about the politics of hope. Okay, so that's interesting. So can you explain a little bit, sort of historically, just because I'm interested to hear, about the relationship between othering an individual as a witch? In my head, I want to call it witching, but that might not be the correct term. Othering an individual as a witch and Puritanism. Can you explain, not necessarily sort of a short history of how that happened or why that happened, or the biggest or the sort of initial illustrations you can think of?
Absolutely. There's kind of so many circumstances. I mean, and a lot of historians are still trying to unpack the actual reason. I mean, I don't think women were genuinely flying around casting spells, feeding their familiars, but it kind of speaks to why were people saying this? Why were they clinging on to it and doing this? And you have to realize that then the witch was very real. It was a very real threat, and especially they came to realize, well, they didn't think she had green skin then, so she could be in your home. That could be your neighbor, so better safe to say it is my neighbor than just in case. But it really comes down to, it could have been, community rights. It could have been somebody was a little too mouthy. Someone was up to something they shouldn't have been. It was usually the most marginalized were the ones that were targeted, and it just comes down to scapegoat society as well. Society needs its scapegoats. It's built on these rituals and the need to purge, I guess. So in Puritan society, it was very easy to do that, to get everybody on board, because if you weren't accusing somebody of being a witch, were you open to being a witch? You have to realize, put yourself in that mentality, which I think Robert Eggers tries to do with the witch, is place us as spectator, but place us into this Puritan society and say, in that movie, we do see the witch as a real entity. And that's how Puritans did see her. She was a femme fatale. She was a crone. She was your daughter. So it could be anyone. And you were weak-willed if the devil could get you.
I always find it one of the strangest things. I remember when I was on a holiday once, going to Salem in Massachusetts and wandering around all the witch-related exhibits and stuff. And I think only when we look at the history of the persecuted of this can we begin to start to attempt to not necessarily right injustices, because there's another question there as to whether or not those injustices can be written or can be sort of changed or made right, but whether or not we can start to prevent these things from continuing to happen in our own time. This leads me to another question, which is, what would be sort of the greatest issues today for you that illuminate who society contemporarily grasps as being the witch?
That's quite interesting. I mean, even now compared to history, really depends on culture. I think Egyptians needed their witches. In Ireland, we considered it very different based on superstitious belief. But in modern society, I mean, there's places in Africa where there's witch camps still going on. There's a fantastic movie that documents it, I Am Not a Witch. And it's so bizarre to see that still prevails in society.
Yeah, no, it is. It's amazing, really, to think that, you and I are sat here having a conversation through the internet, and to think that there's still sort of this odd sort of string of thinking which doesn't seem to have changed at all in the last sort of 400 or 500 years. Is very, very odd. Okay, so one thing I'd like to move on, thank you for discussing that, but one thing I'd like to move on to, this is a question that I ask every single guest that appears on the podcast. How do you understand the political? What is the political for you?
That's an interesting question. The political for me, I guess, in some senses, it can be a form of oppression, but in others, it can be empowering. It's just, there's a very big divide on who can have that power and who can't. And I think that's something that my work, I try to put into it anyway, is that we need to revert these power structures, and the political can do that because that is the power hierarchies in society, the political figures. And I think we need, we're very unbalanced right now on who has power and who doesn't. So for me, I think, yeah, it does. It really comes down to power relations.
Interesting. Okay, so I have a special question for you to sort of come alongside this question of the political, which is, aside from the discourse around otherness, how can literature and mythology and sort of stories and legend about the monstrous illuminate something of those power structures of the political?
I think a big example of it is contemporary feminism is combing through all of these sources, rereading them from an empowered perspective. And for example, Lilith was, as you said, responsible for cot death. You know, she was a child-consuming demon. She left the Garden of Eden. God sent angels after her, and you know, she was like, I'm mad. I'm going to kill 100 kids a day. But now feminist mythology brings her back and said, well, Lilith was the mother of demons. She was the first witch. She was the first female monster. She was all these things. But now we look to her and we say, well, she's pretty powerful, you know, and a lot of people want to identify with Lilith and her ability to say, you know, I'm not going to listen to Adam. I'm out. Which is, although it was a big source of damning her, now we look at it and we say, yeah, you go, girl.
No, I couldn't agree with you more on that. Okay, so I do actually have one question on the back of that, which is, why do you think so many resist that? Even sort of women in society, why do you think so many women resist that reflective turn?
I guess it's change is scary. Nobody wants change, but you know, it's not always going to be in your control, and it's most definitely not always going to be in your favor. So I guess feminism now, the way I look at it and the way they approach the likes of the witch and the monster, is they're reshaping their own history and saying, you know, you're not taking that from us. You're most certainly not taking our future, because we're going to start taking that back from you too. But I do think it's like during the Reagan era, and you had Phyllis Schlafly and you had the Eagle Forum. Some people just don't want it. They're scared of change, which is fine. But then there's this need that you need to understand. You know, it could be for the better. You know, you don't need to oppress other people to move on up.
Completely, and I think there's such a connection there between sort of the power of narrative formation and discourse, and perhaps even in a Foucauldian way, that's really sort of important there. Especially sort of, as we say, sort of revolving around this notion of the monstrous and the witch. It is important as a lens of discussing sort of persecution and otherness. Okay, so my very last question I'd like to ask you, Chloe, is, and this is again something I ask everybody, is if you had to recommend to some of my listeners a few books to read on the topic and a few films as well, what would you recommend?
Oh God, there's so many. The Monster Theory Reader by Jeffrey Andrew Weinstock is absolutely brilliant. I mean, even if you want to just start into monster theory, reading culture, Jeffrey, forget his second name there, Cohen, that's it. These are the books that have started new conversations on monster theory. The Monster Theory Reader is like a toolbox, and then it describes difference. Fantastic book. But I think one odd one I might recommend is read the Malleus Maleficarum. Even read a few segments of it, and it's so horrible. It's shocking, and it kind of makes you think of contemporary society. Don't go too far into it, because I've read the whole thing and it make you distraught. Other sources I might recommend. There's quite a few I really enjoy in terms of monsters. The Forest and the Eco-Gothic, Elizabeth Parker, is really good. There's parts in that kind of explain to us how we still remain holding on to aspects of fear, like the forest itself. You know, we're just conditioned to hold on to these things of fear and identify them. For films, in terms of the Witch, I would recommend The Witch. That one's very, very good. It's kind of, as well, I'd encourage people to revisit movies that they would have had in childhood and the likes, like Hocus Pocus, massive favorite of mine as a kid. I rewatch it now and I'm like, all right, well, they've got the femme fatale, they've got the woman who sniffs out children for potions, and the old crone obsessed with beauty. You really see these stereotypes that haven't shifted.
Yeah, no, completely. I was actually thinking of asking about Hocus Pocus about 15 minutes ago. So I'm happy you brought that up. Okay, so thank you ever so much for your recommendations, and thank you ever so much for coming on the podcast. It's been an absolute joy to have you on.
Thank you very much. Really enjoyed it.
So I hope you enjoyed this discussion with Chloe Carroll about witches and their relationship to the political. If you'd like to get in contact with Chloe Carroll, their Twitter handle is in the description box to the left, above, right or below, depending on what platform you're using. Alongside a link to the blog, please check out the blog for loads of content which doesn't become a podcast episode. Join the mailing list. And alongside that, please like, share, subscribe and follow. It would mean the absolute world to me.